I'm 31, and I've been waiting 3 years for this exact moment. The 4th of July cookout was at what my parents call their house. Dad was showing it off to the neighbors like he built it brick by brick with his own hands. I was at the grill doing what I always did, flipping burgers and hot dogs while everyone else drank beer and had a good time. My dad, Bowen, walked over with Jim and Sandra from next door, the couple who just moved in last spring. They were asking about the family, making small talk, and then my dad launched into it. He told them I was his failure son, still flipping burgers like some fast food loser at 31. Jim looked uncomfortable, but my dad kept going. He said this was my career peak, providing free labor for family events. My mom, Victoria, was right there and she started laughing, telling Sandra to watch me pretend I was contributing to something. She said it loud enough for the whole backyard to hear. My brother Jackson was on his 4th beer, and he decided to join in. He shouted across the yard for everyone to meet the family's biggest mistake, still living in Mom's basement like a total waste of space. My uncle Rhett thought it was hilarious. He came over to the grill and made some comment about how at least McDonald's workers get paid to flip meat. My cousin Tanner added that his dog had more ambition than me. Then my dad really went for it. He told the neighbors they kept me around for entertainment value, that watching me pretend I mattered was the real show. Everyone laughed. The whole backyard full of relatives and neighbors and my dad's work buddies, all of them laughing while I stood there with the spatula. I smiled. I kept grilling. I watched the flames and thought about the phone call I was going to make that night. Here's what they don't know. What they've never known because I never told them and they never asked. 3 years ago, my grandmother passed away. She left me the house. Not them. Me. The house they've been living in. The house they think they own. The house my dad shows off to neighbors. It's mine. Has been for 3 years. The deed is in my name. I've been paying the property taxes out of my salary from my actual job, which is definitely not flipping burgers at McDonald's. I work in IT project management and I make good money. Not amazing, but good. Enough to cover a mortgage and property taxes on a 4-bedroom house in a decent suburb. My grandmother knew exactly what she was doing. She'd seen how they treated me for years. After I graduated college with my computer science degree, I moved back home to save money and pay off my student loans. I took the basement bedroom because it was bigger and quieter. I could work from home down there when I needed to. But my parents started telling everyone I was a failure who couldn't launch. My brother Jackson had gotten into sales and was making decent commission. So suddenly he was the golden child and I was the embarrassment. They never asked what I did for work. They assumed I was working retail or food service because I lived at home. When I tried to talk about my job, my dad would wave it off and change the subject. After a while, I stopped trying. I figured out pretty quickly that they liked having someone to look down on. It made them feel better about themselves. My mom could complain to her friends about her loser son. My dad could make jokes at work about his basement-dwelling kid. Jackson could feel superior, even though he was barely making his rent most months. So when Grandma left me the house in her will, I didn't say anything. The lawyer contacted me directly. She'd put it in the will that I inherited the house, and they could continue living there as long as I allowed it. She knew they'd been treating me like a garbage. She told me once, about 6 months before she died, that she was disappointed in how her son turned out. That's my dad. She said he'd become the kind of man who needed someone beneath him to feel good about himself. I could have told them right then, could have kicked them out or made them start paying me rent. But I had a better idea. I decided to wait. I kept living in the basement. I kept paying the taxes and the remaining mortgage payments without telling them. I let them think they owned it. I watched them get comfortable in their delusion. My dad even refinanced some credit cards using the house as collateral, except he couldn't actually do that because he didn't own it. The bank must have been sloppy with their verification because the paperwork went through somehow, but it didn't matter. The debt was his, not secured by anything real. For 3 years, I watched and waited. I got a promotion at work, started making even better money. I could have moved out any time, but I stayed. I wanted to be there to see it. I wanted to watch them build their entire sense of superiority on a foundation that didn't exist. My brother moved out 2 years ago and got his own apartment, but he still came around every week for Sunday dinner. My mom hosted book club at the house. My dad invited his golf buddies over for poker nights. They lived like they owned the place because they thought they did. The 4th of July party was just the final confirmation that I'd made the right choice. After everyone left, after I'd cleaned the grill and put away the leftover food, I went down to my basement room. I sat on my bed and I called my lawyer. I told him it was time to start eviction proceedings. He'd been ready for this call for months. We'd discussed the strategy in detail. 30-day notice to vacate. After that, formal eviction. All legal, all documented, all completely within my rights as the property owner. He filed the paperwork first thing Tuesday morning. The notice was delivered to the house Wednesday afternoon while I was at work. I came home around 6 and I could hear my mom crying in the living room before I even opened the door. My dad was on the phone with someone, his voice getting louder every few seconds. Jackson's car was in the driveway, even though it wasn't his usual day to visit. I walked in through the side door like always, went downstairs to my room, put my work bag down, changed into comfortable clothes. Then I heard my dad stomping down the basement stairs. He started yelling before he even reached the bottom. He wanted to know what kind of sick prank this was, what point I was trying to make. He had the eviction notice in his hand, waving it around. He said there was obviously some kind of mistake because this was his house, and I needed to call whoever filed this and straighten it out immediately. I told him there was no mistake. The house was mine, had been mine for 3 years. My grandmother left it to me, and I'd been paying for everything since then. I said I was done letting them live here and they had 30 days to find somewhere else. My dad's face did this thing where all the color drained out and then came back red. He said that was impossible. His mother wouldn't have done that. I must have manipulated her or forged documents or something. I asked him if he wanted to see the deed, the will, the property tax records with my name on them. He didn't answer. He just stood there breathing hard. My mom came downstairs then. She tried a different approach. She said surely we could work this out as a family. There must be some misunderstanding. Maybe the will was written wrong. Maybe we could share ownership. I told her no. The will was clear and legal. I owned the house and I wanted them out. That's when Jackson came down. He tried to be the mediator. Said everyone needed to calm down and discuss this rationally. I told him there was nothing to discuss. I'd made my decision. They had their notice. He asked where they were supposed to go. I said that wasn't my problem. For the next week, they tried everything. My mom cried and said she didn't understand why I was doing this. My dad threatened to sue me. Jackson tried to convince me I was making a huge mistake that would destroy the family forever. I didn't engage. I went to work, came home, stayed in my room, let them panic. Then, on Tuesday, 8 days after the notice was delivered, they showed up at my real house. The one I'd bought 6 months ago. The one none of them knew about because they never asked about my life or my plans. They must have followed me from work or something. I heard the doorbell ring at 7:30 at night. When I looked through the window, all 3 of them were standing on my front porch. My dad was crying, like actually crying. My mom looked like she hadn't slept in days. Jackson just looked confused. I opened the door. Before I could say anything, my dad dropped to his knees right there on the porch. He started begging, saying he was sorry, that he didn't mean any of the things he'd said, that I couldn't do this to them. My mom was talking over him, trying to explain that they had nowhere to go, no savings for a deposit on a new place. My dad's credit was too damaged to qualify for a lease. And I just stood there, looking down at the man who'd spent 3 years calling me a failure, who'd humiliated me in front of neighbors and strangers, who'd made jokes about me to anyone who would listen. Now he was on his knees on my porch, begging me to let them keep living in my house. I haven't decided what I'm going to do yet. The eviction is still proceeding. They have 22 days left. Update 1. So that scene on my porch happened on a Tuesday night. For those who said I should just let them figure it out on their own, I appreciate the support. But this is exactly what I wanted. 3 years of planning and they're finally seeing who actually has the power here. I didn't let them in that night. I told them we could talk, but not inside my house. My dad was still on his knees and my mom kept trying to push past me to get through the door like she was going to walk in and make herself at home in my place too. I stepped outside and closed the door behind me. We stood on the porch for almost 2 hours while they tried every angle they could think of. My dad started by trying to apologize for the 4th of July. He said he was just joking around, that I had to know he didn't mean it. Everyone talks like that at cookouts. It was just guy talk, just having fun. I asked him which part was the fun part. Was it calling me a failure in front of the new neighbors, or was it the bit about me being kept around for entertainment? He said I was being too sensitive, that I was taking things out of context, that he'd had a few beers and maybe went too far, but it wasn't serious. I told him it was serious enough that I'd been living in a house he didn't own for 3 years, while he talked about me like I was trash. He tried to argue that Grandma must have made a mistake in the will, that she was old and confused toward the end. I asked him if he thought his own mother was too senile to know what she was doing when she specifically wrote that I inherited the house. He didn't have an answer for that. My mom tried a different strategy. She wanted to know why I never told them about the inheritance, why I let them go on thinking they owned the house. If I'd just been honest from the start, they could have worked something out, made arrangements. I told her that was exactly why I didn't say anything, because they would have tried to work around it, tried to find some way to stay in control. This way I got to watch them show their true colors without any interference. Jackson kept asking where they were supposed to go. He wanted numbers. How much would rent be for a 3-bedroom apartment in this area? Did I understand that their credit was damaged and they'd need me to co-sign? Was I prepared to help them move? Did I realize how much furniture they had? I told him I didn't care about any of that. They had 22 days to figure it out. He said I was being unreasonable. That family doesn't treat family this way. I reminded him about the basement dweller comments. The biggest mistake in the family. He said that was different, that was just brother stuff. They left around 10 that night. My dad could barely look at me. My mom was crying in the passenger seat of their car. Jackson gave me this look like I'd betrayed him personally. The next day, my uncle Rhett called me. He'd heard about the situation from my dad. He wanted to have a man-to-man conversation about how I was handling this. He said he understood I was upset, but kicking my parents out of their home was extreme. I told him it wasn't their home. He said I was getting caught up in technicalities, that the house had been in the family for decades, and just because Grandma put my name on some paperwork didn't mean I should destroy everything. I asked him if he remembered his dog ambition comment from the 4th of July. He said that was just joking around and I needed to develop a thicker skin. Then he told me something I didn't know. Turns out my parents had been telling the extended family for the past 3 years that they'd inherited the house from Grandma. They'd made up a whole story about how she'd left it to them in the will, and I was just living there temporarily until I got my life together. My uncle genuinely believed my parents owned the place. So did my aunt. So did my cousins. The entire family had been operating under the assumption that my parents were the homeowners and I was the charity case. I told my uncle he could believe whatever he wanted, but the legal documents were clear and the eviction was happening. He said I was making a mistake. I'd regret for the rest of my life. That family was forever, and property was just property. I hung up on him. Friday evening, my cousin Tanner showed up at my actual house. I have no idea how he got the address, but I'm guessing someone followed me from work earlier in the week and shared it with everyone. Tanner wanted to talk about the situation because apparently now everyone in the extended family was involved. He said my parents were staying with him temporarily while they figured things out. His apartment was small and his wife wasn't happy about it, but they were family, so he was making it work. He told me my parents were devastated, that my mom had barely eaten in days, that my dad was looking at apartments online, but everything was too expensive. I asked Tanner if he remembered calling me less ambitious than his dog. He said that was months ago, and I was really going to hold on to that forever. I said yes, actually, I was. He said I was being petty and vindictive, that I was acting like a child who couldn't take a joke. Then he said something that made me realize how deep this went. He told me my brother Jackson had been borrowing money from my parents for the past year. Not small amounts either. He'd lost his sales job 8 months ago and had been barely scraping by on unemployment and occasional gig work. My parents had been covering his rent, his car payment, his credit card minimums. They'd been doing it quietly because Jackson didn't want anyone to know he was struggling. But now, with the eviction happening, they couldn't help him anymore. Jackson was going to lose his apartment too. I told Tanner that wasn't my problem. He said it was absolutely my problem because I was the one causing it. If I just let my parents stay in the house, everything would go back to normal. They could keep helping Jackson. The family could stay together. I asked him why I should care about keeping together a family that spent years treating me like garbage. He said because that's what good people do. The weekend was quiet, but Monday brought a new problem. My mom's book club found out about the eviction. One of the women, someone named Marion who'd been coming to the house for years, called me directly. She said she'd gotten my number from my mom and she needed to talk to me about what I was doing. She told me my mother was a good woman who'd hosted book club at that house for over a decade, that she'd opened her home to friends and neighbors, that I was destroying a community gathering space. I told her it was my house and I could do what I wanted with it. Marion said technically yes, but morally I had an obligation to consider the impact on others. That my mother's friends relied on those monthly meetings. That the house had become a social hub. I asked her if my mother had mentioned the part where she called me a failure at a family cookout. Marion said personal family dynamics were separate from community obligations. Then she told me something interesting. Apparently my parents had been fundraising at the house. They'd hosted charity events, neighborhood association meetings, political campaign gatherings. They'd been presenting themselves as pillars of the community, generous people who opened their home to good causes. And they'd been doing it all in a house they didn't own. Taking credit for generosity with my property, I ended the call with Marion, but the damage was spreading. By Tuesday afternoon, my dad's work colleagues had found out about the situation. Someone from my extended family must have talked because suddenly people at his office knew he was being evicted by his own son. My dad called me from his work parking lot. He was panicking. He said his boss had made a comment about the eviction, that people were talking, that his professional reputation was being affected. I asked him how it felt to be humiliated in front of people who respected him. He said this was different. This was his livelihood, his career. I told him he should have thought about that before spending 3 years calling me a failure in front of anyone who would listen. He said I was trying to destroy him. I said no. I was just letting him experience what he'd done to me. Wednesday evening, my parents showed up at my house again. This time they brought Jackson. My dad looked terrible. He'd lost weight. My mom's hands were shaking. Jackson was angry. He started yelling before he even reached the porch. He wanted to know how I could do this to them, how I could watch them fall apart and feel nothing. I told him I felt plenty. I felt vindicated. My mom tried to negotiate. She said they'd pay me rent, whatever I thought was fair. They'd sign a lease. They'd acknowledge I owned the house. They just needed to stay. I asked them how they'd pay rent when they were already broke. She said they'd figure it out. They'd get second jobs. They'd do whatever it took. I told them no. My dad brought up the belongings in the house, all their furniture, their clothes, family photos, my mom's china collection, my dad's tools in the garage. Decades of accumulated stuff. He said they didn't have anywhere to put it all. I told them they had 22 days to move it. He asked where. I said storage units exist. Jackson said I was enjoying this, that I was getting off on watching them beg. I told him he was right, that after 3 years of being treated like the family embarrassment, yes, I was enjoying watching them panic. He called me sick, said I needed help, that normal people don't hold grudges like this. I said normal people don't spend years humiliating their own family members either. My mom asked me what it would take to make this stop. What did I want from them? An apology? Money? What? I told her I didn't want anything except them out of my house. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being fair. She started crying again. My dad put his arm around her. Jackson told me I was dead to him. They left. I went inside, made dinner, watched some TV, went to bed. The eviction is still happening. 18 days left now, and the family is completely falling apart trying to stop it. Update 2. 15 days left on the eviction notice, and the situation has gotten completely out of control. My parents are still staying at Tanner's apartment, and apparently it's causing major problems there. Tanner's wife, Skylar, called me Thursday morning. She got my number from someone in the family, and she was not happy. She told me my parents had taken over their guest room and were showing no signs of looking for their own place. They were eating their food, using their utilities, and my mom had apparently rearranged Skylar's kitchen cabinets to be more efficient. Skylar said she'd try to be understanding because they're family, but this was her home, and she felt like she was being invaded. I told her that sounded rough, but it wasn't my problem. She said it absolutely was my problem because I was the one who'd made them homeless. I asked Skylar if she'd been at the 4th of July cookout. She said yes. I asked if she remembered everyone laughing while my family called me a failure. She got quiet. Then she said that was uncomfortable, but it didn't justify what I was doing now. I told her she was welcome to kick my parents out of her place anytime she wanted. She hung up on me. Saturday afternoon, my dad showed up at a hardware store while I was buying some supplies for a project at my house. I don't know if he followed me there or if it was coincidence, but either way, he cornered me in the plumbing aisle. He looked worse than the last time I'd seen him. He said they needed to talk seriously about the financial situation, that he'd been doing the math and there was no way they could afford to move anywhere decent. I told him to try looking at cheaper places. He said he'd been looking everywhere. Every apartment complex in the area wanted first month, last month, and a security deposit. That was minimum $6,000 before they even moved in, plus application fees, plus moving costs, plus new utility deposits since their credit was damaged. He was looking at needing at least $10,000 just to get into a basic 2-bedroom apartment. They had maybe $3,000 in savings. I asked him where all their money went if they'd been living rent-free in my house for 3 years. He got defensive, said it wasn't rent-free, they'd been paying the mortgage. I reminded him that I'd been paying the mortgage. He said they didn't know that. They thought they were paying it themselves. I asked him to explain how that made sense when the money left my account every month. He said they thought the payments were on auto-pay from their account. Then he admitted something interesting. Turns out they'd been spending extra money for the past 3 years because they thought they owned the house outright. Grandma had paid off the original mortgage before she died. My parents thought that meant they had no housing payment at all, so they'd been spending accordingly. New cars, vacations, my mom's shopping habits, my dad's golf club membership. They'd been living like people with no mortgage because they thought that's what they were. But the truth was, Grandma had taken out a new small mortgage to do some renovations in her last year. That's what I'd been paying off. It wasn't much, only about $800 a month. But it existed. My parents had just assumed the house was free and clear and spent like it was. Now they were broke and had no safety net. I told my dad that was poor financial planning on his part. He said I was being cruel, that I was watching my own parents struggle and doing nothing. I said I was doing exactly what I planned to do, which was evict them from my property. He asked me what Grandma would think of how I was treating them. I told him Grandma was the one who set this whole thing up by leaving me the house specifically because she knew how they treated me. He left the hardware store. I finished my shopping, went home, installed a new shower head. Sunday was when things got really messy. My aunt and uncle on my mom's side came to my house. These are people I hadn't seen in probably 5 years. They live 2 states away and only show up for major holidays. Apparently, my mom had called them crying about the eviction, and they'd driven in to fix the situation. My aunt started by trying to appeal to my better nature. She said she understood I was hurt by what happened at the cookout, but family was supposed to forgive each other, that holding grudges was toxic, that I was destroying relationships that could never be repaired. I told her the relationships were already destroyed. She said they could be rebuilt if I was willing to try. I said I wasn't. My uncle took a different approach. He wanted to talk about the practical realities of the situation. He said even if I was technically within my legal rights, what I was doing was morally wrong, that you don't throw your parents out on the street no matter what they said. That being right wasn't the same as being good. I asked him if he'd ever been humiliated in front of a crowd of people by his own family. He said everyone gets their feelings hurt sometimes. I told him this was more than hurt feelings. They stayed for almost 3 hours trying different strategies. My aunt cried. My uncle got angry. They offered to mediate family therapy sessions. They suggested I let my parents stay in the house if they paid rent. They asked if I'd consider selling them the house on a payment plan. I said no to everything. They finally left around 8 that night. Monday brought a new problem. The neighbors Jim and Sandra, the couple who'd been at the 4th of July cookout, came to talk to me. They'd figured out I owned the house my parents were being evicted from. They wanted to know if it was true. I told them yes. Sandra said that was a complicated family situation and she felt bad for everyone involved. Jim said they'd really liked my parents as neighbors and were sad to see them go. Then Jim said something that made me realize how deep my parents' deception had gone. He told me my parents had been borrowing things from neighbors for months. Tools, lawn equipment, even money on occasion. Small amounts, $20 or $50 here and there. They'd been telling everyone they'd pay it back, but they never did. Jim had lent my dad $200 in April that he'd never seen again. He'd written it off as helping a neighbor, but now he was wondering if he'd been scammed. I told Jim he should ask my parents about that. He said he felt awkward bringing it up now that they were being evicted. I said that wasn't my problem. Sandra said I seemed very cold about the whole situation. I told her she'd watched my entire family humiliate me at a cookout and hadn't said a word. So maybe she should think about that before judging me. Tuesday was when Jackson's situation came to a head. He showed up at my work. I don't know how he knew where I worked, but he found me in the parking lot as I was leaving for the day. He looked terrible. He said he'd been officially evicted from his apartment. He had 1 week to get out. He'd been staying on a friend's couch, but that was only temporary. He needed help. I asked him what he wanted from me. He said he needed money, enough for a deposit on a new place. Maybe $5,000. He'd pay me back once he got back on his feet. I asked him when that would be. He said he was applying for jobs. He had some interviews lined up. It shouldn't take long. I told him no. He got angry. Started yelling right there in the parking lot. Said I was his brother. That family helped family. That I was being petty and vindictive over some stupid comments at a cookout. I told him it wasn't about the cookout. It was about 3 years of being treated like garbage, 3 years of being called a failure and a basement dweller and an embarrassment, 3 years of watching them take credit for things I was paying for while they made fun of me. He said I was exaggerating, that it was never that bad. I asked him if he remembered calling me the family's biggest mistake in front of everyone. He said that was just brother stuff, that brothers talk trash. I told him brothers don't humiliate each other publicly. He tried a different approach, said my parents needed me, that they were falling apart, that my mom wasn't sleeping and my dad had developed some kind of stress rash, that I was killing them with this eviction. I asked him if he thought they were worried about killing me, when they spent years destroying my reputation. He said that was different. They were parents. They were allowed to be disappointed in their kids. I told him they weren't disappointed, they were cruel. He called me oversensitive. Then he told me something I didn't know. My parents had been planning to ask me to move out. They'd been discussing it for months before Grandma died. They thought I was getting too comfortable in the basement, that I needed to be forced to launch or I'd live there forever. My dad had been looking at studio apartments in bad neighborhoods to suggest I move to. They were going to give me a move-out date right around the time Grandma passed away and the will got read. I asked Jackson how he knew this. He said my dad had talked to him about it, asked his opinion on the best way to force me out. Jackson had agreed it was time for me to go. They'd been planning to have the conversation with me in August 3 years ago. Then Grandma died in July and everything changed when the will got read. My parents had found out they didn't own the house and suddenly they needed me to not ask questions. So they dropped the plan to kick me out and just kept quiet about the inheritance. I told Jackson thanks for the information. He asked if that changed anything. I said no, but it was good to know exactly how much they'd been planning to screw me over. He said they weren't screwing me over, they were trying to help me become independent. I laughed. He got even angrier, started saying I was destroying the family over nothing, that I needed psychological help, that normal people don't act like this. I got in my car and drove away while he was still yelling. Wednesday, my mom showed up at my house with Tanner. She said they needed to talk about a compromise. She'd been thinking about the situation and she had an idea. What if they stayed in the house but I charged them rent, market rate, whatever I wanted? They'd get jobs to cover it. My dad could do consulting work. My mom could go back to working retail like she did before I was born. They'd make it work. I asked her how they'd pass a credit check and income verification when they had no jobs lined up yet. She said landlords make exceptions for special circumstances. I told her I wasn't making exceptions. Tanner tried to back her up, said this was a reasonable compromise, that I'd get rental income and they'd keep their home. Everyone wins. I told him it wasn't their home. It was never their home. It was my house that they'd been living in while treating me like trash. He said I was being unreasonable, that I was letting my anger make me irrational. I told him to get off my property. My mom started crying again, said she didn't understand what happened to me, that I used to be such a sweet kid, that something had changed me into someone cruel. I told her I was exactly who I'd always been. The difference was now I had power and I was using it. She said power was corrupting me. I said being powerless for 3 years while my family humiliated me was what really did the damage. She asked what it would take for me to forgive them. I said nothing. There was nothing they could offer that would make me change my mind. They left. The eviction is still happening. 11 days left now. My parents still haven't found a place to live. Jackson is about to be homeless too. The entire extended family is mad at me. And I'm still going to work every day, coming home to my house and sleeping just fine at night. Final update. The eviction happened exactly as planned. I'm writing this from my actual house while my parents are living in a one-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town. Let me walk you through how the last 11 days went down. Thursday, 6 days before the eviction deadline, my parents showed up at my house with a lawyer. Not like a fancy lawyer, just some guy they'd found who was willing to take a consultation for $200. He tried to explain to me that evicting family members created complicated legal situations, that there might be grounds to argue they had tenancy rights beyond what the eviction notice stated. I told him I'd already consulted with my own lawyer extensively over the past 3 years and everything was airtight. He asked to see the documentation. I told him no. He said he'd file motions with the court. I said go ahead. He left. My parents stayed on my porch. My dad wanted to try one more time to make me understand their perspective. He said I was young and I didn't get how family relationships worked, that parents and kids go through rough patches but you don't blow up the whole family over it. I asked him to define rough patch. He said what happened at the cookout was just a bad day. Everyone has bad days. I told him it wasn't one bad day. It was 3 years of bad days. Every family gathering, every holiday, every time they introduced me to someone new. He said I was remembering it wrong, that it wasn't that frequent, that I was exaggerating. My mom tried to explain why they treated me the way they did. She said when I moved back home after college, they'd been worried I was going to get stuck there, that I'd never launch if they didn't push me. So they decided to make living at home uncomfortable enough that I'd be motivated to leave. The comments about being a failure were supposed to make me want to prove them wrong. The basement dweller jokes were supposed to light a fire under me. She said it was tough love. I told her there was nothing loving about humiliating your kid in front of strangers. She said I was being dramatic. I asked them if they thought their plan had worked, if making me miserable had motivated me the way they wanted. My dad said obviously not since I'd stayed in the basement for 3 years. I told him I'd stayed because I owned the house and I was waiting for exactly this moment. The look on his face was worth 3 years of their garbage. Saturday, 4 days before eviction, Jackson showed up with his ex-girlfriend. I hadn't seen Caitlin in probably 2 years. They dated for a while and she'd been around for some family stuff. She tried to appeal to me as someone who'd seen how our family operated. She said she remembered me being kind and thoughtful, that this cruel side of me didn't match who she knew. I told her she didn't know me at all. She said she'd been at family dinners where everyone made jokes about me and she'd always felt uncomfortable. I asked her if she'd ever said anything to defend me. She admitted she hadn't. I told her to leave. Jackson tried a different strategy. He said he'd been talking to my parents and he finally understood the full picture, that they'd messed up, that they regretted how they'd treated me, that they wanted a chance to make it right. I asked him what making it right looked like. He said maybe I could let them stay in the house for 6 months while they got their finances together. They'd sign whatever documents I wanted. I'd have total control. They'd pay rent as soon as they could. I asked him where they'd get money for rent when they were already broke. He said they'd figure something out. Then he told me the real situation. My parents had applied to 15 different apartment complexes and been rejected by all of them. Their credit scores were in the low 500s. They had multiple late payments on their record. The credit card debt my dad had accumulated was substantial. No legitimate landlord would rent to them. The only places that would consider them were sketchy buildings in bad neighborhoods that didn't do proper background checks. They'd found one apartment that would take them, but it was small, run down, and in an area with serious crime problems. I told Jackson that was what happened when you lived beyond your means and made poor financial decisions. He said I was missing the point, that these were our parents and they were going to end up somewhere dangerous. I asked him if he remembered standing in the backyard at the 4th of July cookout, yelling about me being the family's biggest mistake. He said yes, but that was months ago, and he'd apologized. I told him he'd never apologized. He said he was apologizing now. I said too late. Monday, 2 days before eviction, my parents tried their final play. They showed up at my house with Grandma's old photo albums. My mom had the pictures spread out on my porch showing me memories from when I was a kid. Family vacations, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. She said she wanted to remind me that we'd been a happy family once, that we'd had good times, that those memories had to count for something. I looked at the pictures. I told her those memories belonged to a different version of our family, one that died sometime around when I moved back home, and they decided to treat me like garbage. My dad tried to make me see reason one last time. He said if I went through with this eviction, the family was done, permanently. No reconciliation, no future relationship. I'd be cutting myself off from everyone, from family gatherings, from future nieces and nephews if Jackson ever had kids, from family support if I ever needed it. He said I needed to think long-term, that I was making a decision in anger that I'd regret for the rest of my life. I told him I'd been thinking long-term for 3 years, that I'd planned this exact scenario, that I'd known exactly what would happen and I'd done it anyway. He asked me what kind of person does that. I said the kind of person who gets tired of being treated like a failure by people who are actually the failures. My mom started crying again. I went inside. Tuesday, one day before eviction, they tried to physically delay the process. They showed up at the house, my old house that they were being evicted from, and they just sat on the front porch. They said they weren't leaving, that I'd have to forcibly remove them. I called my lawyer. He called the sheriff. The sheriff showed up and explained to my parents that if they weren't out by the deadline tomorrow, they'd be removed by law enforcement and possibly arrested for trespassing. My dad argued with the sheriff for 20 minutes before finally accepting that this was really happening. Wednesday was moving day, the actual eviction deadline. I took the day off work. I wanted to see it. I drove over to the house around 9 in the morning. There was a small moving truck in the driveway. Tanner and my uncle Rhett were helping load furniture. My parents looked destroyed. My mom was moving in slow motion like she was in shock. My dad wasn't making eye contact with anyone. Jackson was there too, carrying boxes. I parked across the street and watched. They saw me. My dad stopped what he was doing and just stared. I stared back. My mom came down the driveway and asked if I was there to help. I said no. I was there to make sure they actually left. She said I was being cruel. I said I was being thorough. The moving process took most of the day. They had a lot of stuff, more than would fit in a one-bedroom apartment. Tanner's truck made 3 trips. Some of the furniture had to go into a storage unit they'd rented. My mom's china collection, my dad's tools, the nice dining room set. They couldn't fit any of it in their new place. By 6 that evening, the house was empty, except for some cleaning supplies and trash bags. My dad came over to where I was sitting in my car. He asked if I was satisfied, if this was what I wanted. I told him it was exactly what I wanted. He said I'd destroyed them over some hurt feelings. I said he destroyed himself by being a bad person. He said I'd regret this. I said I wouldn't. He walked away. They finished loading the truck. They did a final walkthrough of the house. My mom was crying the entire time. They locked the door and left the keys in the mailbox like my lawyer had instructed. Then they drove away. Tanner's truck followed them. My uncle Rhett left in his own car, and I sat there in my car looking at my empty house. I went inside, walked through every room. It was strange seeing it completely bare. My dad had punched a hole in the wall of the master bedroom at some point. There were stains on the carpet in the living room. The kitchen cabinets were damaged. They'd left the place in rough shape. I took pictures, called a contractor I knew, got estimates for repairs. My parents are now living in that one-bedroom apartment in the bad part of town. They're paying $1,200 a month, which is basically all of my dad's unemployment check. My mom got a job at a discount store working retail for a minimum wage. My dad is doing delivery driving for a food app. They're barely making it. Jackson is staying with friends and applying for jobs. He's behind on his car payments and might lose his vehicle soon. The extended family is split. About half of them think I did what I had to do. The other half thinks I'm the worst person alive. Tanner and Skylar aren't speaking to me. My Uncle Rhett called me once to say I was dead to him. My aunt sends me texts every few days about how I destroyed the family. I don't respond. I hired a property management company to handle renting out the house. They found tenants within 2 weeks. A nice family with 2 kids. They're paying $2,200 a month, more than enough to cover the remaining mortgage, the property taxes, and leave me with profit. The house is generating income now instead of being a drain. My parents tried to contact me a few times after they moved out. My mom sent long text messages about how hard their life had become, how they were struggling, how they didn't know how they were going to make it. I didn't respond. My dad tried calling from different numbers. I blocked each one. Jackson sent me a message saying our parents were falling apart and it was my fault. I told him they were adults who made their own choices and faced their own consequences. Last week, I drove past their new apartment. It's in a rough area. The building looks run down. There were people hanging around outside who looked like they were dealing something. The parking lot had broken glass. This is where my parents live now. The people who called me a failure, who humiliated me in front of neighbors and strangers, who spent 3 years making me feel worthless. They're living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the worst part of town, while I own 2 properties and make good money at my real job. Someone commented on my first post asking if I felt bad about what I was doing. The answer is no. I don't feel bad. I feel vindicated. I spent 3 years watching them treat me like garbage while living in my house, while taking credit for my property, while presenting themselves as successful people who owned their home. They built their entire social status on a lie, and now the truth has destroyed them. The 4th of July cookout was 7 months ago. My dad standing there with the neighbors telling them I was his failure son. My mom laughing about me pretending to contribute. My brother shouting about me being the family's biggest mistake. My uncle making jokes about McDonald's workers. My cousin saying his dog had more ambition. All of them laughing while I stood at the grill cooking their food in my own backyard, at my own house that they thought they owned. I made one phone call that night to my lawyer. Now they're all living in places they can barely afford, working jobs they hate, struggling to make ends meet. And I'm doing just fine. Better than fine, actually. I'm thriving. My parents are exactly where they belong, at the bottom, where they tried to keep me for 3 years. Except I was never actually there. I was always above them. They just didn't know it. That's the end of it. The eviction is done. My parents are out. The family is fractured, and I have absolutely no regrets about any of it. They wanted to treat me like a failure who flipped burgers for a living. Now they're the ones struggling while I own property and make good money. The irony is beautiful. The justice is perfect, and I'm done with all of them.